Okay, so let's review our 6 evidences, and this is from the biological sciences, and these are more of your recent evidences. There they are. Evidence number 1 is that the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. That is an assumption. How old is the Earth according to the Bible? Yes. Yes, roughly 6,000, maybe 7, but certainly nowhere near 4.6 billion years old. What are the 3 reasons why this is an evidence? Or let me ask you this. What do they base this on? 3 things. Yes?
Uniformitarianism.
Yes. The idea of uniformitarianism, which is a foundational pillar of geology. Another one? Yes? Radiometric dating. And the third is more philosophical. Why is the Earth 4.6 billion years old? Yes?
They need it to be that
They
old?
need it to be that old. In order for the mechanisms, supposed mechanisms of evolution to work, we need millions and millions of years. Evolution, according to one of the tenets, is those are extremely slow processes requiring millions and millions of years. So the Earth is 4.6 billion years old is simply an assumption. It's an assumption that we need. We do base it on radiometric dating, and it's part of the uniformitarian idea of geology. So the reason that we assume the Earth is 4.6 billion years old is because we need it to be that old, and it's a foundational pillar of geology, that the processes that we see, and only the processes that we see, are the ones that shape the face of the Earth. That's called uniformitarianism. Also, radiometric dating. However, radiometric dating we'll mention last because radiometric dating is relatively new compared to the ideas of evolution. Then the fossil record. What I want you to know about the fossil record is the fact that it does not document evolution. This is a fallacy. So if we look at our 6 evidences in a little more detail, the first one is an assumption. The second one is simply not true. And this is one of evolution's best kept secrets. They would have you to believe that they find all this fossil evidence and they use the fossils to try to assemble some evolutionary progressions. Well, it goes the other way. They already have their evolutionary progressions and they try to find fossils to fit what they've already decided. So the fossil record documenting evolution is simply not true. What do we see in the fossil record? The most important thing we see in the fossil record is separate and distinct animals. An animal appears in the fossil record, remains relatively unchanged, and then becomes extinct, and we don't see it in the fossil record. We are missing the transitional forms that are required by evolution. We also see a lot of death and destruction on a massive scale. What's our explanation for the death and destruction on a massive scale in the fossil record? Yes? The flood. So the fossil record does not support evolution. It's a problem, and that's why Stephen Gould came up with an alternate mechanism. What is his alternate mechanism? What's the name of it? Punctuated equilibrium. And basically the mechanism we are attacking is gradualism. But there is that alternate mechanism, and it's a direct result of no transitional forms in the fossil record. We also talked about homology. Homology is when we trace similar structures. It's also called comparative anatomy. That's actually the basis of most evolution, is comparison of similar structures. Now today I'm going to go through the first 2 on this slide, the evidence number 4 and 5, and then also evidence 6. So evidence number 4, living things are fundamentally the same. Is that true? Yes, but it's misinterpreted in light of evolution. Then diversity and variety is the result of natural selection. In particular, diversity and variety is natural selection in action. What do evolutionists claim is the basis of all the variety that we see, whether it is in the animal kingdom or the plant kingdom? What is the basis of that? What's their answer? Yes? Mutations. Mutations are supposed to be the basis of all the diversity and variety that we see. So we need to understand about mutations. That's a misinterpretation. We're going to say that diversity and variety was built into your DNA or the DNA of living things by God. It's not the result of random mutations acting over and being selected by natural selection over millions and millions of years. And then we're going to talk in detail about adaptation to environment. That's not a misinterpretation. That's a what? Representation. That's a bait and switch on terminology. We're misrepresenting what the word evolution means. We're trying to prove macroevolution by illustrating it with microevolution. Okay, so that's a misrepresentation of terminology. So evidence number 4, are organisms fundamentally the same? At what 2 levels? Cellular and molecular. Okay, so there are similarities. But what do evolutionists do? They emphasize, even exaggerate similarities and downplay dissimilarities. So that's why I'm calling this a misinterpretation. So all living, the first way that cells are alike. How are cells alike? How are living things alike? They're all made up of cells. So we just said that evidence number 4 is the fact that living things are fundamentally the same. How are living things fundamentally the same? Can you answer that? The first way is that they're all composed of living cells. The cell is the fundamental unit of both structure and function. So we have cellular components that are uniform, and we have cellular processes, whether they're physical processes or chemical processes, that are essentially the same. Doesn't matter if it's a plant cell or an animal cell. For example, we said that there are 2 types of cells, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. We're primarily talking about eukaryotic cells. All eukaryotic cells have what 3 basic structures? The nucleus, 2 more? Yes? The plasma membrane, and the third is just cytoplasm. Okay? So all of your cells are very uniform in structure. Their cellular components are the same. They have a membrane-bound nucleus, they have a highly organized cellular structure, and they have the plasma membrane. What is the plasma membrane called? It's uniform throughout cellular life. Yes? Phospholipid bilayer. Okay? So if you look at the cell, there's the nucleus, there's the cytoplasm, and we have the same, very similar organelles, and there's the plasma membrane. You can see that right here. It's a phospholipid bilayer that is interspersed with very specific functioning proteins. Okay? So that particular component of the cell is uniform. Cells have the phospholipid plasma membrane, and it has a dual layer of phospholipids and interspersed proteins, and it doesn't matter if it's a plant cell or animal cell or a human cell. So the cellular components themselves are uniform. And I also said that the processes are similar. If we go back to here, you can see in this cell we have the mitochondria that I'm pointing at right here. Mitochondria are pretty much uniform across cellular life as well, and they all have the same function. It's called cellular respiration. And these processes are very similar between cells. So are living things fundamentally the same? Yes, at the cellular level and also at the molecular level. What does that mean? It means that the different types of biomolecules, whether they're proteins, carbohydrates, or lipids, are also the same. They're the same basic molecules among living things. And then Different proteins found in different animals are very, very similar. And of course, the main structure that we highlighted that is uniform is DNA. What is DNA? It's deoxyribonucleic acid. It is the genetic blueprint of all cells. Okay? All cells carry their genetic information in the DNA molecule. Okay, there it is, deoxyribonucleic acid. It has a very classic structure, famous structure discovered by Watson and Crick, and it's called the double helix, that twisted ladder. And that is the genetic code, the sequence of those 4 bases, adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. And the sequence of those letters, those 4 letters act like an alphabet. And they literally have a code that tells the cell exactly what proteins to produce, and it also includes the control mechanisms that tell the cell when to produce that protein and in how much of that protein, what amounts to produce it in. So DNA is a very important molecule, and it also is difficult for evolutionists to explain. You can see the double helix. Here's the rungs of the ladder. They're made of deoxyribose sugar. This is sometimes called the sugar phosphate backbone. And then the rungs of the ladder are very specific molecules, the A, T, C, and G, and they are here in the middle, and they pair together. It's called base pairing. That's the structure that makes up the genetic code. That is your DNA. And here is the molecular structure. All the atoms were worked out and how they fit together by Watson and Crick. So, are organisms fundamentally the same? Yes. But how we interpret that similarity is based on our worldview. When I see similarity, it makes sense to me because we have the same creator. And an evolutionist, when they see similarity, they're looking for common ancestor. All right? And there's no such thing as a simple cell. Okay, the complexity of life is astounding. Do you remember I said this, and I want you to remember it. We can excuse Charles Darwin. Why? Charles Darwin was in the 1850s. What did he not know? Genetics. And what else did he not know? Even more recent. What? The complexity of cell biology, but what even more than that? Molecular biology. The cutting edge of biology today is not even cell biology. It is molecular biology, where we are trying to understand the complexities of life on the molecular level. How does the DNA determine the proteins of the cell? What controls it? What turns it on? What turns it off? That's the level of biology today, molecular biology. Charles Darwin had no idea. Remember the title of Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. The idea there is when we open the black box, and the more we understand the complexity of the cell and the complexity of living things on a molecular level, the more astounding it becomes and the more impossible evolution becomes. Okay, so complexity has to be what? Directed and designed. Complexity and random mutations do not go together. So gradualism is inadequate as a mechanism to explain the complexity of life. And they don't really have any detailed steps on exactly how this could have occurred, even though we are decades into cell biology and molecular biology. Evidence number 5. Evidence number 5. Diversity and variety in the living world is the result of natural selection. Of course, the basis of this would be mutations. And of course, Darwin, who was Charles Darwin in brief? He was a British naturalist. But what about him? He provided the mechanism of natural selection. That's the whole basis of gradualism, is Darwin's natural selection. Okay, so that's his contribution. That's why he is so important to evolution. He gave a mechanism to something that they were already determined to believe, that scientists wanted to believe, and Darwin gave them the mechanism. Of course, evidence number 5 is a misinterpretation. We don't deny that there's diversity and variety. What we do deny is the fact that natural selection and evolution, in particular mutations, are the basis for it. So there's variety. Choice. Infinite creator providing all the variety, infinite creator designing that variety into the DNA, or natural selection using random mutations. That's the choice. Infinite creator that designed diversity into the DNA, or natural selection using random mutations. What's the answer? The 3 steps of gradualism. Gradualism is the prevailing mechanism for evolution today, also called Darwinism or Neo-Darwinism. So we need to understand and review the 3 steps of the mechanism of gradualism if we're going to attack it. Step number 1 is variation by random mutations. Okay. Step number 2 is natural selection, promoting the survival of the altered gene that is best suited. That's natural selection. And then we have to have accumulation of small changes. That's why it's gradualism. So how did the variety come to be? According to gradualism, which we just reviewed, their answer would be mutations. Mutations are the basis of variety. A creationist viewpoint would answer that God's design, built into the DNA by God. So what's the cause of diversity and variety? Random mutations being acted upon by natural selection over millions and millions of years, or God's design built into the DNA. What's a mutation? It's a permanent alteration in the DNA sequence. What makes up the sequence? Those 4 bases: adenine, thymine, cytosine, and guanine. That is the genetic code, and the sequence of those 3 bases in the DNA molecule make up genes. And so if we have alteration of that, then we will have a mutation. Do mutations occur? Oh, absolutely. Are they random? Yes. But are they the source of all the diversity and variety? Types of mutations are important to understand this argument, because we can say that a mutation is kind of like a misspelling in the genetic code. What happens to documents that become more and more filled with misspellings? What happens to them? The information in them becomes garbled, correct? So what does mutations do to genetic information? It makes it garbled and non-functioning. So the idea here is we have millions of years and we have all these different mutations, and eventually we get some type of a misspelling or a mutation that alters the gene in such a way that the gene becomes a better functioning protein. That's what we're saying here, and that's why we said that we need those millions and then billions of years of evolutionary history. So a point mutation is a single base pair change. I mentioned cystic fibrosis. Cystic fibrosis is a point mutation, single base pair change, which results in a defective protein. And that defective protein affects the mucus in people's lungs and in their digestive tract, and it becomes a very serious disease. So here's an example of a point mutation. You see the DNA, you see how it is a double helix, and you can see the base pairing. Right here, this is a single base pair where instead of having the CG, that's a base pair, C and G paired together, we now have a different base pair, T with A. You see C and G chemically pair, A and T chemically pair. They can't, that chemical pairing is based on chemical bonding. It can't be switched. A always pairs with T, C always pairs with G. So this will cause a change in the resulting protein. A couple of things can happen. The protein itself will be malformed, or the protein won't be produced. That's a mutation. We're going to talk today about sickle cell anemia, which is a mutation also. And that changes a very particular protein, the hemoglobin protein. We'll get there in just a minute. We can have a deletion insertion, where we have a single base pair or an even entire portion of gene, causes what's called a frame shift. So it would be like inserting a letter in a word. Not only does it garble the word, but it could potentially shift everything over so that, what if we insert a space? We can shift the reading frame over. So that is a frame shift. That also either causes the protein sequence to be terminated, so the protein isn't formed, or the protein does get formed, but it is functionally mutated. There's some examples of a insertion. So natural selection and mutations together, do they produce new and improved organisms? No. There's some reasons behind that. First of all, deals with our DNA itself. God designed our DNA. In the first place, we have 2 copies of every gene, do we not? You know that you have half of your genes from your father and half from your mother. You have 46 chromosomes, 23 pairs. So you have 2 copies of all of your genes. And which one's expressed kind of is a little different. That's why you are a genetic blend of your parents, who are a genetic blend of their parents, and so on and so forth. That's the source of diversity and variety, built into DNA by God. Okay, so most mutations will not be expressed because we have a backup copy. Another reason mutations will not be expressed is because DNA can repair itself. Okay, so mutations, that's why we need millions and millions of years, because DNA will repair itself. Then the second reason that gradualism fails deals with natural selection itself. I think I said this on Thursday. If I were to call you a mutant, that's not exactly complimentary, is it? And so is natural selection going to be selecting mutants? The answer is very, very rarely. Maybe something might happen. As a matter of fact, we have some illustration of that with sickle cell anemia or with antibiotic resistant bacteria. But in general, natural selection would choose against mutant forms. So one of the second step of the mechanism kind of eliminates most of the first step. It eliminates most mutations. Natural selection works to preserve existing kinds. Survival of the fittest works to preserve the mutant forms in a species, unless somehow, some way, once in a while, we get a good mutation. Good mutation. What does that sound like? Sounds like an oxymoron. All right, so conclusion. Do mutations explain variety? Here's where we need to spend more time. Here's why I'm repeating this lecture. Mutations result in a loss of genetic information. Information is very dependent on the sequence of the letters in the words that make it up. So if we have mutations, which are similar to making a misspelling in a document, what happens to the information? It becomes garbled. So what happens when the genetic code becomes garbled? We call it a mutation. And most of the time that organism does not survive. Does it confer survival advantage? It does in the case of malaria and sickle cell anemia, but that's in a certain circumstance in a certain location. If you happen to live in sub-Saharan Africa, okay, and are exposed to malaria, then having sickle cell anemia is advantageous. Normally, having sickle cell anemia is not. And then again, mutations are not expressed. Your DNA is redundant. Remember, you have 2 copies. And your DNA has the ability to repair itself. Only as we age and get older do we start losing the ability to repair our DNA. Also, with mutations, there are two types of cells in your body. You have your germ cells, which are your reproductive cells, and then you have what are called somatic cells. Those are the cells that make up your body. So if you have a mutation in your somatic cells, do you pass that on to your children? Do you? No. You only pass your genetic traits onto your children in the germline cells, in the reproductive cells. So most of the mutations that cause disease and so forth, they occur in the somatic cells. As a matter of fact, we call those diseases cancer. Is cancer directly passed from parent to offspring? No, because cancer is mutations in the somatic cells. Now, the tendency to get cancer is in the genetic makeup of people, and it can be traced. There are certain genes, they're called oncogenes, that confer a tendency to get a particular type of cancer because of the way the person is made up. But cancer is not directly genetically passed because it's a mutation in the somatic cells. So for mutations to even be passed, it has to occur in the germlines, in the reproductive cells, which are passed from parent to offspring. So a lot of the mutations that we think of are not even passed from parent to offspring. So there's all kinds of problems with mutations as the basis of variety. So, and then most mutations are not expressed. So mutations may contribute to variety, but even if they did a lot, what's the problem? It still does not explain the origin of DNA itself. If you compare what's called the genome is the sum total of all organisms' genetic makeup, all its chromosomes, all its DNA. It's called the genome. If you compare the genome of bacteria to the genome of an invertebrate, to the genome of a vertebrate, to the genome of a mammal, to a genome of the human genome, there's a whole lot of increase in genetic information. How did those genes arrange themselves? Millions and millions of years of mutations? That does not make sense. So even if we do get variety through mutations, which we'll talk about, even if we do get a lot of variety through mutations, it still doesn't explain the original DNA itself. Do you understand that? It does not explain the origin. Let's talk about Charles Darwin again for just a minute. What did he call his book? The Origin of Species. Did Darwin cover the origin of species really in that book? What did he document? He documented diversity in variety on the Galapagos Islands in particular among finch. Did he explain the origin of the finch? No. So here's another play on words, misrepresentation, I guess is what we're going to call it. Misrepresentation of terminology. This doesn't explain the origin of DNA itself. How did this highly organized code come into existence in the very first place? Mutations? It's kind of like the origin of the universe. Where did matter come from in the very, very first place? There is no explanation for it. Another thing I want you to remember somewhat from the first section is the idea that evolution cannot explain the three foundational questions of life and of the universe. What are those three foundational questions? What are they? Where did matter come from? Evolution explains that how? Big Bang. How did life begin? How does evolution explain that? The biochemical relay. And the other one is, why is man different? Evolution cannot answer those three fundamental questions. And it comes down to what I'm saying right here. Mutations may contribute to the variety of an organism, but they do not explain its actual origin. Where did DNA come from? Evolution does not have answers for foundational questions. And what does the Bible have to say about those three foundational questions? Where did matter come from? Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? How did life begin? Day 5. What did God do? He created living creatures, the life consciousness. And then why is man different? Because God created him in his image. So which of these ideas has more faith? Which one? Does it take more faith to believe in God as the creator? Or does it take more faith to believe in random mutations somehow arranging themselves over millions of years into something that is highly, highly, highly complex? Okay? We could study cell biology for an entire lifetime and still not understand the complexities of the cell, or molecular biology. That's why scientists have to specialize, and they will study one particular area. Many of them will study one particular thing for their entire life. So, here's where we left off. There's the chromosome. So let's now take some time on evidence number 6. What is evidence number 6? Evidence number 6 deals with the organism's ability to adapt to its environment. Is this an illustration of evolution? Is adaptation to environment evolution? This is a misrepresentation of definitions. What do we mean by evolution? What do we mean by evolution? Remember, evolution began, the word evolution means unrolling as a scroll. It means gradual change, but that's not how it's commonly used. When I say evolution, and when evolution is referred to in normal conversation and among scientists, they are not talking about gradual change, the unrolling of a scroll. They're talking about descent with modification. How did Charles Darwin summarize it? Numerous, successive, slight modifications. Remember, Charles Darwin did not know about those modifications being called mutations. He didn't know about genetics. So when we use the word evolution, we are talking descent with modification. We're talking about the origin of life. We're talking about the origin of species. We're not talking about adaptation to environment. We're misrepresenting what we're even talking about. It's also a misrepresentation of the levels of change. Do you remember the 2 levels of evolution? Macroevolution is what we're really talking about when we're talking about descent with modification. We're talking about large-scale changes into a different kind of organism. We're talking about the origin of species. We're not talking about microevolution, which is observed small changes within a species. Do species change? Yes. Have species changed since the flood? Have they? Not basic kinds, but they have changed a lot of variety. Think about the dog species. Canis familiaris. How many different dog varieties are there? Too many. And how do we get the dog varieties? We can actually choose dog varieties, can't we? There's all kinds of dog varieties that are deliberately bred, correct? So there is a lot of flexibility in DNA, isn't there? But what's the proper view of the flexibility in DNA? That it was designed that way by God. Not that we've had all these mutations that happen to come give us some type of survival advantage, okay? Think of all the different dog species. We can design a dog that, is hypoallergenic so that people that are allergic to them can have them. We designed different dogs are bred to be able to run faster, et cetera, et cetera. Why? Because there's flexibility in the genetic makeup, but that flexibility has certain boundaries. Those boundaries were set by God. When? During creation. So when we are dealing with adaptation to environment, are we dealing with change? Absolutely. But it's only small scale within the genetic boundaries established by God. And all of the illustrations of it are all within the boundaries of kind. We're just not getting anything new. We're just getting a different variety of the same organism. So do adaptations prove evolution? Well, what is adaptation? Let's define our terms. Adaptation is the tendency of an organism to adjust to its environment. Do organisms adapt or change to their environment and different conditions in their environment? Yes. This is what Charles Darwin observed on the Galapagos Islands. This is what he observed among the finch populations. Different styles of beaks. But does that explain the origin of the DNA that codes for those different beaks? What we're going to find out is that adaptation to environment is simply a reshuffling of the population that has characteristics that are already present. It doesn't explain origin. It still doesn't explain origin. So adaptation is the tendency of an organism to adjust to its environment. Does that occur? Yes, again, absolutely. But our problem is the explanation behind it and the interpretation of it. So evolutionists claim that adaptations prove macroevolution. But what are adaptations? What level? What level are adaptations? Micro. Within species boundaries, within kind boundaries. There's not a direct correlation between the scientific or biological species and the Bible kind. The Bible kind is broader, and the species definition is very specific, and even that's not agreed upon. We're going to counter with the fact that adaptations were programmed by God into the DNA, and they have limitations. Is there, keep using that little phrase, flexibility within the DNA? Yes. But we're going to counter that that flexibility in the DNA was designed by God, and it is limited within certain boundaries. Here is one of the all-time big examples of adaptation to environment that is used to promote illustration. It's an illustration of adaptation that is used to promote evolution. It's used to prove that things adapt. Well, yes, they adapt, but our point is it's not evolution. It doesn't explain origins. So let's talk about the story of the peppered moth. This is a misrepresentation of what's actually going on, and it's been set forth for decades and decades and decades in biology textbooks as evolution in action. So is the peppered moth of England actually evolution in action? This goes back to the 1800s, okay? And the idea that we have these two forms of a moth. Of course, the genus and species name is Biston bicellaria. And there are two varieties. The typica variety, which is a very light-colored moth, and the carbonara variety, which is very dark, almost completely black. So there's two varieties, same genus name, same species name. Okay? And so, according to this evolutionary story, the white peppered moth, you can see, here he is, on the dark bark. Can you find him over here? Only because they circled it. Okay? So, we have two forms, the typica, light-colored peppered moth, and the carbonara, dark-colored peppered moth. Well, at the beginning of the 1800s, the white variety Again, it's still the same genus and species. The white variety was the predominant species. That means that there were more of them in number, okay? Then something happened in the 1800s in England called the Industrial Revolution. A lot of pollution. This is the story put forth still today as proof of evolution. So in the Industrial Revolution, we have a lot of pollution. And then if you see this tree bark is covered with lichen, okay? Grows on the, it's a type plant that grows on the bark of trees, okay? It's actually a symbiote. It's algae growing with fungus, so it's not really even a plant, but it grows like a plant on the bark of trees. Well, the Industrial Revolution comes along, pollution's there. Well, this sounds like a good environmental story too. Pollution comes, and what happens to the lichen? It dies, and so we have less and less and less lichen-covered bark. So all of a sudden, well, no, I guess not all of a sudden, but eventually, what happens to the white variety of the peppered moth? Here we are camouflaged. Here we are not. So according to the story of the peppered moth, after the Industrial Revolution, the darker moths increased in number. They became the predominant variety. Still the same species, still the same kind of plant, same kind of moth. So now the darker moths have better camouflage because the lichen is no longer growing to the extent that it used to before all the pollution. Okay? So the theory then would be that because the environment changed, the moths changed. Well, there's two problems with that. Did the environment change? Yes. Did the moths change? No. It was simply a shift in population. The dark moths were already there. The white moths, the white light-colored moth variety was already there. We had a shift in the number of the two varieties. So is that evolution in action? No, it's a very superficial example. It's not, nothing really changed. We just had a shift in population. Does this illustrate natural selection? I guess it does. But does this prove that natural selection causes evolution or drives evolution forward? It doesn't. All it proves is that natural selection is a valid biology principle. And we don't deny that natural selection is a valid biology principle. We deny that it's evolution. Do you understand that? Can we observe natural selection? Yes, natural selection is going to affect the populations of a species. Dark variety versus lighter variety. Does it explain the origin of the moth in the first place? No. Does it illustrate how something changed from one species into another? It doesn't even do that. So it doesn't explain the origin of the moth in the first place, and it doesn't show one species changing into another. Does it? Is it evolution in action? No. It's natural selection, but it's not evolution. Is it adaptation to environment? Yes, but it's not evolution in the way that we use that word. It's not descent with modification. It's not a good illustration at all. It's a very superficial illustration of change. But does it explain origin? Does it show one thing changing into another? No. So it cannot be used as proof of evolution. Okay? There's a lot of problems with this. There's been a lot of criticism, especially from creationists, but we don't even need the criticism. There's been arguments that say that, oh, peppered moths, this is kind of interesting. Peppered moths don't even rest on the bark. They rest on the branches. So there's all kinds of little shady things about this whole idea anyway. And then there's the idea that the man that really developed this as an illustration of evolution was a doctor named Bernard Kettlewell. And they're saying, well, his techniques were faulty. He came up with his proof by doing a release and capture. He released a whole bunch of dark and white moths into a wooded area, and then he recaptured them and counted them again. Okay, so I don't know the exact numbers. Let's say he released 300 of this and 150 of this, and then he recounted them. So his techniques, there's a question about his techniques in trying to prove the numbers that he used as his basis. There's also the question of the pictures. Many of the pictures, some people accused him of forgery, as in he glued the moss to the bark for his pictures. Did he do it or did he not? I don't know. So there's a lot of shakiness involved here, but we don't even need to attack this itself because it doesn't prove anything anyways. They're still peppered moths, okay? So this whole thing is shaky in more than one way. Now, malaria and sickle cell anemia. Malaria and sickle cell anemia. Okay, malaria is caused by a protozoan. It's not a bacteria, it's not a virus. It's a larger single-celled organism. It's called Plasmodia, is its genus name. And what Plasmodia does is when you're infected with it, it attacks the red blood cells. And basically, do you know what red blood cells do? They carry oxygen in your blood, correct? Basically, the red blood cell, once it matures, it's hardly even a cell anymore. It loses its nucleus and so on. It basically becomes an inner tube of hemoglobin floating through your bloodstream. Hemoglobin is a protein, so that means it's coded by DNA. Hemoglobin has a high affinity for oxygen. Hemoglobin binds with oxygen and becomes oxyhemoglobin. And that's the physical means of delivering oxygen through your bloodstream to all your cells. Of course, your cells have to have oxygen to perform cellular respiration and harvest energy. So oxygen is required. You know that. What is sickle cell anemia? Well, what happens is a person with sickle cell anemia, it's of course named by the fact that the red blood cell loses its nice little inner tube donut shape and becomes in the shape of a sickle. And this is due to the fact that the hemoglobin, basically this whole inner tube of a red blood cell, is just floating hemoglobin. The hemoglobin is malformed due to a mutation. So the hemoglobin makes the red blood cell deformed into a sickle shape. So what does this do to a person? It makes them very inefficient in transporting oxygen. And there's different levels of sickle cell anemia. Okay? The point is that this is a mutation. And so we're going to use this as a illustration of a mutation causing a survival advantage. Because, lo and behold, if a person has sickle cell anemia, what happens? The Plasmodium organism cannot infect their red blood cells because they're deformed. So they can't get malaria. Because malaria is a disease where the organism attacks a person's red blood cells. That's why they get the fever and the chills as their body is trying to fight off this organism. And it's also a very serious and reoccurring infection because those Plasmodia organisms can hide in the person's red blood cells. But if you have sickle cell anemia, the Plasmodium organism cannot infect your red blood cells. You won't get malaria. I guess that's a survival advantage if you live in sub-Saharan Africa or some other tropical places. Okay? Do we worry about malaria here? No. Malaria is a very specific disease caused by a very specific organism that is transported in a very specific mosquito. Okay? So, sickle cell anemia. Does sickle cell anemia confer resistance to malaria? Yes, it does. It's observable. There are people that are in very high malaria infected areas that do not get malaria, and it's because they have sickle cell anemia. Okay? Because the Plasmodia species cannot infect their red blood cells. So persons with sickle cell anemia are resistant to infection that causes malaria. Does this illustrate evolution? Well, it does illustrate a mutation giving a survival advantage. Can you see why evolutionists are so happy with this illustration? Because it is a mutation, and it does confer a survival advantage. But is it evolution? No, the people with sickle cell anemia are still fully human, right? And the survival advantage is only limited to a very particular location with a very particular disease. Yes?
And it's not like they're living.
It's not like they're living better. Yes.
They still get sick from the sickle cell.
Right. They can't get sick with the malaria, so they're not going to die, let's say, of malaria. Instead, they're going to die of sickle cell. So it's just not a good example, no matter how you look at it. Does it explain the origin of the red blood cell? Does it even explain the origin of hemoglobin, a protein? Does it illustrate a mutation? Yes, but that's it. Here's another new favorite, antibiotic resistance. Okay, antibiotic resistance is the process whereby a population of bacteria become resistant to a particular type of antibiotic. You've all heard of MRSA that can be acquired after a hospital stay because there's a lot of this bacteria present in hospitals. MRSA stands for methicillin-resistant Staph aureus. And this is a serious problem. There's also another type called VRE, vancomycin-resistant enterobacteria. Okay? This is a big problem in the medical profession, MRSA and VRE. But does it illustrate evolution? Okay, so antibiotic resistance. This deals with bacteria. Bacteria are very unique. Bacteria, though, are prokaryotic cells. They are not eukaryotic cells like ours are. And the resistant characteristic, what happens is antibiotics work very specifically on bacteria. Certain bacteria are susceptible to certain antibiotics. That's why proper use of antibiotics involves a doctor's prescription. Okay? And so the doctor will know that you have this type of infection, so he's going to prescribe this category, at least, of antibiotic, and that particular antibiotic has a certain mechanism that it attacks the cell with. So what can happen is bacteria might be resistant to the antibiotic because it doesn't have the characteristic that the antibiotic attacks, or it has a mechanism to resist the antibiotic's mechanism. So it does happen. But bacteria are very unique in that they can readily get new genetic information from other bacteria. The bacterial genome is not in a nucleus. Bacteria do not have a nucleus. They just have a bacterial chromosome. They also have a circular chromosomes called plasmids, and they're able to transfer plasmids from cell to cell. They share their genetic information all the time in different ways. So it's not unusual for bacteria to share characteristics. So bacteria readily acquire new genetic material, mostly by sharing plasmids. So what happens is your non-resistant bacteria are going to be quickly killed off by the antibiotics. So that leaves the resistant strain able to multiply. So again, what do we see here? We see a shift in population. Before, you had all these bacteria, most of which were not resistant, and a few were resistant. So when you expose them to the antibiotic, all the non-resistant ones are killed off, and it leaves you with the resistant ones, and they're going to multiply. And they're going to share their DNA back and forth with each other, and eventually you're going to have a very hardy strain of bacteria that's not going to respond to a particular type of antibiotics. That's the problem with MRSA. Okay? But this is natural selection. It's still not evolution. It's still the same species of bacteria. So here we are back to square one. Does it explain the origin of bacteria? No. Does it show bacteria evolving into a different species of bacteria even? No. It's just illustration of diversity and variety. It's adaptation to environment. And actually what happens when the antibiotic is removed? Many times they will revert to what's called wild type. And we'll go back to having a higher number of non-resistant bacteria in a population. So here's a little diagram of basically what happens with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You have a lot of bacteria, no antibiotic yet. And there might be a couple that have resistant characteristics. You can see them here. You expose the bacteria to antibiotics, and all of the non-resistant bacteria die off, leaving you with just your resistant strain. And they're going to multiply, 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 multiply. And they're even going to share that resistance with others. So you're going to have a big problem. You're going to have antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and it's not going to respond to normal treatment, is it? But is it evolution? There's a cool picture of those. I don't even know what kind they are, but I thought they looked neat. So conclusion, is adaptation the same as evolution? Is it? We illustrated adaptation to environment. We know that there's diversity and variety in our species. Is it the same as evolution? No. Do organisms adapt to their environment? Absolutely. But our point is that it's not really evolution. How do creationists explain adaptation to environment? Do organisms adapt? Yes. It's designed by God into their genetic makeup. And it's within boundaries. So it's designed into their DNA and it's limited. We're not going to get new species. Does this argument make sense to you? We're not going to deny the fact that natural selection is a biological principle that we can see in nature. But we are going to deny that it's evolution. We are going to deny that it produces new species. We are going to deny that it explains the origin, the actual origin of anything. What we were talking about, whether it's sickle cell anemia, whether it's the peppered moths, or even antibiotic-resistant bacteria, what is it really? It's a population shift. It's a fluctuation of traits which were already present. It doesn't explain the origin of those traits. You say, it's a mutation. Well, yes, but it's not evolution. It doesn't explain the actual origin of the genetic material either. So it's just a population shift. Think of those moths. We already had the dark variety. We already had the light variety. It was just a change in the number of dark versus the number of white under different circumstances. That's all it is. It's a population shift. How many black compared to how many white depended on the environment. Yes?
Just out of curiosity, how do your secular colleagues respond when...
They're going to make fun of you and say everybody knows that. It's hard to get them to respond, to argue with you.
Intelligent.
Calmly. Okay, and it's hard to explain. It boggles my mind how people who know a lot about genetics, I know a little bit about genetics, it boggles my mind how people who know genetics can believe this. And I guess it comes down to the willingly ignorant that the Bible talks about. So, last thing is, does it result in new species? So the question is adaptation the same as evolution? The answer is no. So there's our 6 evidences. You promised me you're going to know them. And there's just a cool picture of cells. We'll see you on Thursday.